most people consume via plausible means. So yeah, I'll just ask questions, I guess, for myself, or if anybody, like there's a text side channel that people ask me questions on.
Yeah,
Um,
perfect.
do you guys mind if I interrupt in the middle?
No, 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 not at all.
Perfect. And then let's see, I'll just bring up my notes. I'll just take notes in the meantime, so I have summary for actually the vast majority of people who, because they come from very different backgrounds,
Mhm.
they don't show up. They just read the notes and then decide whether this is the sort of thing that they would care about, which is actually
Yeah,
very healthy ultimately, because that means that people who normally don't go into like like physicists might get, catch up on
yeah, yeah,
sociology and hopefully notice that they common patterns, which
yeah.
there are actually a
Which
lot
is,
of
I mean, it's really that's why we're so excited to do this, just to like talk about our stuff for people we don't normally get to talk to, and it's really
exactly,
interesting
yeah.
to see. Yeah, no, it's great.
And like my observation from running this thing for like 4 years is that like modeling things, they're not the same, but they rhyme a lot across the different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, that's like we deliberately steal the techniques of other people and then apply it to history, and so it should be a lot of like the method should be familiar, even if the
Yeah.
concept is. Yeah.
And a lot of times it's a lot of problems that machine learning has in being stable have already been solved by economists like decades ago.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so they have bad data, small amounts of bad data, whereas ML has large amounts of bad data.
yeah, yeah,
Um, what? Uh, oh, controlling for, like, you see a bunch of polar bears and black bears, polar bears on a white background, black bears on a green background, right? And the model picks out the background, not the bears.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's the two things confound each other. So how do you remove the obvious portions of your input? So
Mhm.
control for your covariates
Yeah,
in,
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
epidemiology, econometric speak, to predict the thing you do care about.
yeah. Exactly.
Oh, cool. That's
Oh
Jim.
yeah, it looks like it's working. Okay, perfect.
Excellent. So then let me.
Wow, okay. It's almost like technology. All right, I can concentrate now.
Very good.
Awesome. So then, yeah, it's about time. So let me just start the recording, give you guys a really brief intro, and then like the time is yours.
Perfect.
So yeah, hi everybody. I'd love to introduce Jim Bennett and Daniel Hoyer from. I guess you've had a long career right now, but yeah, they've been modeling the arc of human civilization for a number of years, and like computationally to actually make sense of it all. And they'll present their latest work. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Greg. Jim's here. I'm here. We're both part of the Seshat Global History Databank project and the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna and the new organization SODI. We will talk about all of this.
Right.
I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll jump into it. Yeah, okay. Hopefully you can see this. Excellent. Yeah, so as Greg said, really happy to be here and want to just talk a little bit about our work modeling societal dynamics and using historical data to try to understand really just how do societies function, how do humans work in groups, what's going on, what has happened in the past, what's going on today, maybe a little bit about what can we expect from tomorrow, and just trying to put it all together. Really happy to be here talking to a sort of diverse crowd, a different kind of audience, and just get your thoughts on how this all might work. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction, then pass it over to Jim to talk about detail some of the work that we've done, especially modeling projects, and then I'll sort of wrap it up and talk about where we're at and some next steps. But just to kind of give us a little bit of a framing and jump into it, just want to explain sort of why we study history, why we think it's important, why we think it might matter and be interesting to others out there as well. One of the things that always sort of strikes me, and I'm an historian by background, turned kind of complexity scientist, is that, more than people think, what's going on today and a lot of the challenges that we face today, the issues, but also the opportunities and some of the benefits that we experience today mirror those of the past to a surprising degree. Not everything is new, not everything is novel. There are some differences, but a lot of the patterns, a lot of the underlying dynamics are really similar. Just the basic need to coordinate people and resource at increasing scales, at increasing complexity, the way that humans interact with each other groups, the environment, all of these stresses. These are all very familiar from the past. One of the observations that we have in the past that's a little unsettling is that when we look at it, every society that has ever existed in the past, one way or another, has ceased to exist. They do not exist today. They're gone from the map. That's disturbing. That's the reality. What this means is that, you know, the reason, the pressures, the challenges that drove them into collapse are very similar and familiar to those that we're facing now. In my mind, this gives a bit of urgency to what we're trying to do, right? It's not just the sort of idle trying to understand things from thousands of years ago. There are connections, there are lessons to be had in the past that we can apply to today. The reason we know this, the reason we can say fairly confidently that all societies in the past eventually disappeared or collapsed, is because we're doing this work. This is sort of at the heart of our work together with other colleagues as part of the Seshat Databank. Really, this is just a long-term project trying to gather information about as many different societies from as many different parts of the world, from as long and far back as we possibly can, bring all that information together and start to try to uncover and trace some of these patterns and the deviations, right? What's unique, what's contextual, and what's common and familiar in these different settings, and try to sort of test theories with causal models. We'll get into that a little bit later. As I mentioned, Jim and I and some other colleagues are also putting together a new organization called Societal Dynamics, or SODI for short, which is really trying to take this work, take this historical understanding, translate it into maybe some insights that could have relevance today. And we'll talk at the end a little bit more about that. It's really what I want to just walk you through quickly. I want to save time for questions and discussion as well. Just want to talk a little bit about the methods, what we actually do, how we turn history into data, into quantitative stuff that we can analyze. As I say, Jim's going to talk about some of our recent modeling successes, some interesting projects, and go through the kind of methods and how we go about doing this. Then I want to just talk about our current work and some future focus, especially around the sort of modeling efforts and more future-focused translational work. So in terms of what we actually do, how we take the sort of messy, complicated, deep historical record, turn it into something analyzable, something usable, we take what we call a clear dynamics approach. This is a sort of new term that was developed by our colleague Peter Turchin about a decade or so ago, named after Clio, who is this sort of ancient Greek muse of history. And, you know, dynamics, of course, is just the study of change over time. Really what this means is we're trying to bring a scientific approach to studying the past. So really, you know, all of the methods, all of the tools, all of the outlook that has been successful in what we might call the hard or natural sciences, bring it to bear on questions about the human past. So this is quantifying information. This is statistical analysis, testing theories, pitting theories against each other, building models, but also never losing track of that sort of what we call thick or qualitative historical data. So not abstracting away all of the nuance, all of the context, but having quantitative information alongside of the qualitative and contextual information. This is really the sort of innovations of the Seshat project. As I say, we've been around since 2011, trying to gather and curate the sort of most, what we like to call the most comprehensive set of knowledge about human history in one place. Do it in a way that's structured, that's clear, that's workable. Seshat, by the way, she's just named after the ancient Egyptian goddess of wisdom, record keeping. We kind of redubbed her the patron saint of databanks. She was in charge of sort of inscribing, you know, the pharaohs, all the pharaohs' names, how long they reigned, and all that. So we thought she was a good inspiration for building databanks. So the way that we do it is we sort of start with this kind of spatial awareness. We have this world map. We pick spots on the map. We drill down. So in any one sort of area in the world, you can drill down and say, okay, what are the different societies that occupied that spot, that piece of land throughout time, going as far back as we can? And so doing this then gives us a list of what we call polities. So these are just historical societies, states, quasi-states, chiefdoms, different scales and complexity, but social units. So this then gives us a list. So this is just an example of, if you look at Egypt, you start to build a list like this. This is just going back to the late Neolithic, the Badarian, Naqada period, the early Pharaonic period, and so on. and you just start to list these societies. You do this for different parts of the world. We've since kind of filled this out. We're expanding every day, every week, more and more polities, more and more things to look at. I think we now have something like close to 800 different polities in our data bank that we have some information on. So this is the starting point, and our unit of analysis is always these polities themselves. This is what we are looking at. We may talk about regions, we may talk about long time periods, but the focus is these polities with specific start and end dates and specific sort of territorial extent. So once we have that, we have the list of our sort of targets of the different societies we want to explore. Then we start to develop, okay, well, what information do we want to know about these societies? This is then developed as a code book. We consult with experts, we iterate. So for example, we do this kind of project by project, different topics one at a time, and we kind of build out the data bank like that. So one of our early kind of successes was looking at social complexity. What is it? How do we characterize it? How does it change over time in different parts of the world? So to do this, we first articulated 51 different variables drawn from theory, drawn from the literature, from what other scholars have asserted in the past are the kind of key dimensions of social complexity. We just said, okay, well, let's put all of these together. What has anyone said characterizes social complexity? And we came up with 51 different elements sort of grouped together in these 8 or 9 different categories. So then we take these variables. These are things like the population of the polity, the territory, different aspects of the government. Do you have professional bureaucrats and administrators? Do you have judges? Do you have a formal legal code? These sorts of things, aspects of their monetary system, information, technology, whatever. So then for all of these variables, we then go to our list of polities and say, okay, are these variable or were these features present or absent in this polity? And that's how we basically turn history into quantitative information. Some of these are numbers, like polity population might be a straightforward number. Most of these are kind of binary codes. It's a present or absent, which can then be turned into zeros and ones and aggregated in different ways. And so this is the quantification procedure. Initially, as I said, we had 400 societies that we did this sort of initial pass for. We've now almost doubled that.
So question.
Yeah.
How do you deal with the evolution of, let's say, the legal code? I'm thinking like England went from like each duke had its own legal code, the king had its own courts, and the king's courts were trusted and evolved to get part of the king, blah, blah, blah. That's like centuries long, right?
So that's exactly what we're trying to uncover is that kind of change. And so the way it works, again, is we go polity by polity, but the key thing, and this is why we really need to consult with experts, and this is just a picture of one of our workshops these are all very super famous historians and archaeologists sitting around discussing some codes. This was a meeting in Oxford a few years ago. So what we do is we capture what is actually known about each society. And often that is, there's unknowns, there's missing data, there's disagreements among scholars. Some people will say, yeah, you had a formal legal code at this particular period. And others will say, well, no, not quite. It doesn't come in until 20 years later, whatever. So we capture all of that information. We can timestamp each of our values. And when you stack those polities together and you say, okay, well, let's look at a sequence of polities. Let's say that occupied England from, the end of the Roman period into the early modern period. You can then code each of them for these different aspects. You can code changes within a polity for these different things, maybe within the polity lifespan. It started out not having a legal code and then got one. We record that information. Then when you put it all together, you can basically draw that sort of time series, that sort of dynamic diagram to show the rise and fall of any of these different categories or social complexity as a whole. Whatever you want, you can start to actually uncover those patterns. Then you can start comparing the same thing with different regions, and that's how we start to put this all together. So this is exactly what we're trying to do. It is very laborious. It is very intensive and costly, just the human effort involved. Again, there's a lot of iteration. There's a lot of checking. It's reading the literature. Literally, we send students out to the library and say, hey, read a bunch of books, code all this, come back. We're going to talk to experts. They're going to tell you to read a whole bunch of other things, and we just kind of keep going and build up the data bank from there. So it's a lot of work, but the payoff is once you can do that, You take all of this information that is just, decades of research and writing and dozens of books and articles, and all this information is available, but it's scattered, it's unstructured, it's just living in the minds of expert historians. So really what we're trying to do is just collate it, structure it, put it all in one place so that we can use it. Once you do that effort and start to build this kind of critical mass of data, of information about the past, then you can start to do the cool things. You can start to analyze things. You can start to put this together. So for example, we had a very good success with that social complexity data collection. We did, for example, principal component analysis to look at, in different times and places, how consistent is the correlation between the different sort of factors. It turned out it was very high. The first principal component explained like 80% of variance throughout history. That was a big finding. That was something that we could only do after we had put it all together. This is just a simple kind of histogram. This is some current work looking at crises in the past. Again, different areas, different time periods, showing how frequent different kinds of things happen as a result of social crises, civil wars, deposition, assassinations, etc. So again, it's only when you actually put together this information in a structured and packaged way can you start to explore these kind of large-scale patterns and really do this quantitative analysis. And then you can get in, as I said, with the clear dynamic approach, you can start to really do some scientific analysis, some theory testing, theory building. So for example, this is a graph where we had this sort of idea, again, drawn from the literature, this theory that major increases in the scale, the territorial extent of polities in the past were a result of and kind of reaction to major increases in military technology. The idea being that these sort of bumps in military technology just make the sort of cultural evolutionary pressure to then have societies who are kind of fearful that they're going to be overrun. They organize, they get larger, they get more complex. They dive into and access more of the resources that they have control over in a way to kind of defend against other sort of neighbors who have these scary technologies. So this is the kind of theory this draws it out. Then we can develop causal models based on this theory, look at, okay, scale jumps and, run a bunch of simulations, manipulating the different parameters and testing it against the actual empirical evidence. This is a little hard to see. These dashed lines are different simulation runs. The thick line, the blue line underneath, is the empirical historical record. If you put it all together, you can see these kind of major jumps. This line here is an increase in military competition. This is the model. Again, it's a very simple kind of toy model, but it shows that this theory driven by military technology matches pretty well the actual historical record in terms of these sort of scale dynamics. And again, this is hundreds of different societies that we're looking at that are included here. So this is pretty novel. This is not the way that history is usually done. It's more scientific, it's more quantitative, trying to put this together and actually, put things to the test. So instead of just building new theories or arguing back and forth forever, we're really trying to put some theories that have, been a little bit specious, maybe had gained some attention, but they just don't hold up. They're just, they're not supported by the empirical record when you do structured systematic analysis. We want these to be in the graveyard. So again, this is just an example. Yeah, sorry.
So one challenge of doing all this is confounding. So to what extent do you have enough data to have quantify the covariates of a society to make it conditional or I guess independent of the details of the society?
Yes, most of the time. And again, it's we go project by project, question by question. And so the amount of data, the amount of sort of covariates and the amount of controls that you can include and need to include depends a little bit on the scope of your specific question. So for something like this is a major question. So recently we published a paper that took our sort of first principle component of social complexity and said, okay, well, we think we have a handle on what social complexity is. What are the different factors that may have actually driven the increase and decrease of social complexity throughout time in different parts of the world? And here again, driven by theory. Right? We're not theory neutral. We're not just throwing data at it. We are taking explicit causal theories from the literature and formalizing them and then putting them to the test. And so that, you can then pull apart the different covariates. You can test the interrelationships between the different driving factors as well. And so here, for example, we had a bunch of different very high profile theories, like the hydraulic hypothesis has been around since the early 20th century. Like, these are long-standing theories about what drives social complexity. Grains make states, information technology, big God sort of religious and cultural matters. And then again, we had our sort of military revolution, warfare intensity, the sort of technological things, and some very drivers about productivity in agriculture. We can go into details, but we sort of put this into a test, very simple kind of regression model, looking at different time series, trying to control for other relationships between societies as well. So looking at like phylogenetic connections to look at sort of cultural similarity to control for, let's say, inheritance of common traits from polity to polity, and other sort of autocorrelative factors as well that we're trying to control for. What falls out of it is that these factors, these seem to be very strong drivers throughout the information in our data bank. The other theories, again, very prominent, very famous scholars have supported these. These just go away, they fall out. This is really the payoff. This is what we're trying to do, is really turn history into a proper science where we can make predictions, we can derive causal models, and then we can put those to the test against the empirical record. And then finally kind of move on from some of the theories that sound good, but they just don't hold up. And then this just helps us clarify some of the ways that we think human societies function, some of these dynamics, which can then help clarify how we approach issues today, which again, we'll come back to in a little bit. So this is the back. This is basically how we work. Again, we can go into more details about the specific methods and all of this data, what it looks like. But really, the point is just to try to have structured quantitative information about the past in as many categories, in as large of a representative sample as we possibly can. Now, I would like to turn it over to Jim to talk about some of the details of some of the kind of modeling work and really turning these ideas, turning these theories into causal models and then testing that, and what does that actually look like. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second, Jim, if you want to take over for a bit.
Okay. Let's try that, and this, and that, and play.
Yep.
Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right, I'm going to talk to you today about two models. The first one is an agent-based model that tried to model the spread of the large-scale societies of the old world in Eurasia from 1500 BC to 1580. And what you see here is the first piece of data, which is a movie of the spread of very large-scale states over time. You can see time clicking away here, and you can see various states forming, lots of the Chinese empires rising and being more or less stable here. Rome follows, and the like. So we have we've encoded at this resolution a map of the world and how the states formed, and you can see it's repeating here. And the other piece of data that we have that we want to try to match is the population of the old world. This is taken from a well-known data set of just in the old world, what the population did. It rose from about 60 million people to about 400 million people, with dips because of the Justinian plagues here and also the Black Death, which the model does not attempt to try to do. But we want to try to get roughly this curve and try to explain this data was the plan. And if you take a look at those two data sets, you see a number of interesting sub-patterns. The first is, if you look at the amount of land that the states, these are just large-scale states, occupy, early on it was fairly stable, but then it grew actually quite rapidly. And there were two growths. The blue line is the number of agrarian states that occupied where you could grow things. And the separation, where this is the total amount, this difference is the set of steppe empires that occupied this region of the old world. There's this highway of grass, the steppe region, that the nomadic peoples occupied. And you can see that there used to be very little difference in terms of states, but then states started to grow in the nomadic region. And so we want to account for this difference and account for the overall growth. This map shows the density in over 3,000 years of where states formed. And you can see that there's quite a lot of density, quite a lot of activity here in the Middle East, and also quite a lot of activity, of course, in China. It's occupied by states for a long period of time. And then states finally began to occupy toward the later region into Eastern Europe and into Russia, Western Russia. But there were also states, large-scale confederations that have to be accounted for in the steppe region. Overall, if you look at the thing, this is the total number of states, both agrarian and steppe nomad, that existed. So this gives you a budget of the total number of states that this model should generate. And if you look at the distribution of states according to their size and how long they last, you get this kind of interesting distribution. This, again, is from the historical record. You see that there are quite a number of very small and very short-lived states. And there are a few that are relatively long-lived, like about 10 centuries, but they're all fairly small. And all the big guys all last less than 5 centuries. So big sizes don't actually get you longer life. These guys out here are things like, of course, all the Chinese empires, but also the Roman Empire and some of the steppe empires, the Shuangyu and like. They can occupy actually quite a lot of area. So what we wanted to be able to do is explain both the movies that I showed, the population data, and some of these statistical regularities. So we wanted to build an agent-based model of this, and this would be then a generative theory about how large-scale polities came to occupy and collapse. So the first thing that we did was to split the agents. They all are states occupying multiple regions in this somewhat realistic geography. Single regions were considered to be hinterland, not really states at all. And there were going to be these two types, as I've mentioned. There will be these agrarian states that occupy land, grow some kind of crop, and turn that into people. And then nomadic confederations, which were nomadic people who lived on the steppe. And each one of them would have a very small set of fairly uniform behaviors that we could end up scaling by various parameters to see if their interactions would generate the appropriate patterns. And then we would run this, we'd plunk down a set of states and turn the thing on. And then there were a bunch of constraints about how these states could unfold. There was clearly geography that would limit where the states could actually grow crops or where nomads could actually roam. We had some technology that was asserted. And of course, most of the interaction was between the states, and that was a lot of war, in particular, between the states that we wanted to track. We knew that there would be some exogenous contingencies that had to be placed on the model to try to get it to go. And the question was, would the historically known contingencies actually help to explain why the model spread the way that it did? And there were three major ones. There were regional productivity changes, the way that they grew crops in 1500 was radically different from the way they did it in 1000 CE. And we wanted to be able to capture that increase in productivity because that meant more people, which meant stronger and bigger armies and things of that nature. We knew that there were these asymmetrical threats from military innovations. Dan pointed out that in a previous slide that there were these growths of adopting new types of technologies, first bronze, then the use of chariots, then the use of cavalry, and eventually gunpowder, which is beyond the scope of this simulation. So we wanted to capture those things. And we also, I won't talk about this very much in these slides, there had to be some relatively efficient military transport improvements in some portions of the world in order to be able to explain it. And we wanted to see if that was really going to be the case. So let's just concentrate on the two types of polities really quickly. There's the agrarian states, and this is roughly what they do. They have a center, and they organize a bunch of cells. So here's a polity that begins, and it has its population is broken into two parts. One is just the productive workers that are growing the crops effectively and generating a surplus, and then a bunch of specialized warriors. That is a fraction, 5% in almost all simulations of the population that are specialized for war. Those are the people that can do the battle, and they are structurally limited because it takes soldiers to support the warriors at a distance. There's logistical constraint on the size of these states. So what ends up happening is that they occupy more land, and that permits them to grow more crops, which allow them to grow more warriors. And you can see the population growth here in the dash line. They continue to expand, but eventually the military logistic constraint kicks in, and they can no longer expand the empire, but they continue to consume the remaining surplus. And the model was very simple. Once it got to 85% of the surplus allotted to the warriors, they ended up turning not to trying to take over more land from the state, but from taking over all the goodies between one another within the polity. That caused a civil war, a split, and so the population was split into two, not always along these nice horizontal lines, but randomly chosen. And there would be a war that would happen on the borders. They would consolidate the state, but then, depending on the geometry that was available, the geography that was available, one could, for example, get much larger than the other. And you can see this kind of growth of the different states at different times as their population grew from new annexation that this state couldn't get to. This one now can, because it has a slightly different capital and its logistics allows it to spread. This allows states to spread throughout the simulation. This is how states end up spreading. And overall, what you see if you do the aggregate statistics, if you just did it with this set, you would see that the population would slightly drop and then grow as a consequence. Both the land and the population would grow together. So it would be this line that we would try to match against the overall area.
So a question about this.
Yes.
A key driver here is, as you expand to more land, you need a larger fraction of the population to become warriors, and you need to feed. Oh, it was not clear also whether you need to feed them even more as a fraction because there are more of them, or there's some like logistical things.
Again, it's 5% of the available surplus. So as the state increases, that 5% as an absolute measure increases as well. So yes, there are more warriors, but to a first approximation, they're effectively consuming the same amount. Actually, since they lag, more of them are probably consuming a little bit more. And as it gets out here, then they really start to actually feel the pressure of trying to get what they previously expected their due. That's part of the original theory that motivated this behavior, which is the demographic structural theory of Jack Goldstone and Peter Turchin.
So let me get this one. It's that if it's always 5%, is it, I mean, as the state expands, shouldn't it always be feeding them? Like they're the same fraction amount, or do they want more, or does logistics not allow that produce to actually get to this group?
The logistics inside are not modeled in any great detail. So the idea is that within each time step, whatever surplus is able to be generated at the time, given the number of people that's available, 5% of that gets distributed to all these warriors. Now, if the warriors continue to increase in number, then the total amount that they get out of that 5% individually decreases, and that is what is causing this consumption and this conflict between them all, is that they are having to share the same amount with more and more people, and that gets them quite upset. That's the underlying theory.
That's what I missed. Why is it the same amount? Isn't the empire expanding and therefore generating more?
No, that's the point, is that there's an underlying military logistic limit that you cannot actually expand the empire arbitrarily. It depends on how the soldiers are able to arrange themselves to logistically get the warriors out to the border to be able to get new land. And that's a theory that actually Kenneth Boulding, an economist, generated quite a while ago, where it takes more soldiers to be able to support the warriors out at a distance. It's actually a binomial sort of distribution. So the state cannot grow arbitrarily. It depends on its military technology. But once you have a set of military technology, including the ability to do roads and the like, that limits the size of the state that can actually be managed and not be annexed at the border by somebody else who has the same technology, but actually happens to be a little closer, so is able to get more people to come and battle.
Okay, so what threw me off is you're assuming, so your story suggests something more like the fraction of the population that's warriors is increasing, and the relative surplus is about the same, so they starve. But I think the way you parameterized it is you have a fixed amount of surplus and a fixed fraction of the population is warriors, and they starve that way. But as long as you can get them starved, it works out.
I think the way that you have to think about it, though, is that there is not it only becomes a fixed amount of surplus once the military logistic portion of the program kicks in. At this point, it's not fixed. The total amount of surplus is growing because the land is growing. Yes. Once it gets to this point, then you're correct. Then it becomes fixed, but the population continues to grow, and it's that dynamic that allows this whole amount of time to elapse before this trigger point and this collapse. So it's actually the combination of two things that's going on. It's actually fairly subtle, because what ends up happening is if another state, I mean, this is all the complication that you would look at in the long presentation. If there's another state like this one that happens to encroach into your territory, then your territory is decreasing and you can get triggered earlier, because now you have the same number of elites, or a slightly smaller number of elites, but you really lost a lot of capacity. That could trigger a civil war in this guy. So there's a lot of path-dependent computation, but it's because of this dynamic that there's a while when, if you can expand, you can keep ahead of the game. The warriors are happy, they're trying to catch up, there's plenty. But once you get constrained, and it's not only because of your internal logistic agreement, it could be because you ran into oceans or you ran into another larger polity. Whatever it is, it then stops the growth of the state, and you eventually take yourself out because you either exceed the surplus that's available, or you run right into it because of your birth rate. Once that happens, whatever the reason is, that's when this split occurs, and you have an internal civil war. You get much more excited about your neighbor than you do from your nearby state.
Right. And you're also racing against your own technological development. So that's one potential way out, because now you can project farther, you get your different technology.
Exactly. So, which will then bring us to, thank you, the asymmetrical military shocks are exactly this thing that we talked about. And the major one that happens in this period is the steppe nomads. There are very few people out on the steppe nomads. I mean, the total population of the steppe in this period at its peak was probably about 4 million, compared with the 400 million that we think was the total population. Like 1% or less is the steppe nomads. But they developed these new cavalry tactics, riding horses and using compound bows, these composite bows, and be able to work as a group to be able to come and threaten the fairly sedentary armies of most of the agrarian states at the very beginning. Now, they're doing it not just to take all the goodies right at the beginning, they're doing it to force a better trade patterns between that are the long-term things that the steppe did. They were a highway of all sorts of goods from the east to the west, and they wanted to control that and be able to control the trade commodities. And so effectively, they were extorting good terms on both sides of the bargain because they were the highway. That's really what was going on. And as a consequence, what ends up happening, and Dan alluded to this, is that the agrarian guys faced with this learned and actually bought the horses and the like, learned about cavalry techniques and adapted them in order to be able to defend themselves against this kind of thing. And that led to this power race of the nomads starting something, the agrarian states responding, getting a little better, the nomads figuring out how to get much better about organizing themselves, and the agrarian guys having to defend themselves against that. And that allowed these mirror empires to grow along the steppe agrarian border, which is how we get large scale both steppe and agrarian states that happen in time in this both the simulation and in history. So, and this one factor is been posited to explain about 90% of all the states that were greater than 1 million square kilometers in this period, this 3,000-year period. So how does that model work? Well, it's simple. Yep.
Can you give an example of these mirror states? Because it sounds like it's like border polities between these two regions, right?
There is the well, the border region is because of the grasslands, which were not good for growing crops. So the agrarian guys never went into it.
Okay.
And the steppe guys, they didn't want to raise crops; they wanted to buy them effectively.
Yeah.
And so neither. Well, it's not really strictly true. If there was one way that happened, which the model doesn't do, is that the steppe nomads in their later periods became so dependent on the goodies that the larger agrarian states did that when they saw the agrarian states beginning to collapse, they actually went in to run them. The famous examples, of course, of the Yuan and the Mongols, where they went and took over the head of the Chinese states and ran them for quite a while. So, but to answer your question directly, they stay on either sides of the border, at least in this model, and right, and their empires grow, and the classic pair, the very first classic pair of the really big one, is actually the Scythians against the Achaemenids, and then on the eastern side, it's the Xiongnu against the Han, about 500 years later, and you'll see that here in the data here in just a moment.
And maybe just for something maybe I'm more familiar with, it sounds a lot like Fall of Rome, where you have a bunch of Asian invaders, and I think a bunch of like Visigoths and like states between them that sat around for a while. Is that a good model?
Yes and no. Certainly the Goths and the like, they were fairly organized tribes. Not necessarily, they didn't necessarily have the same technology. In fact, they didn't. They didn't have the cavalry technology. The Romans actually educated them about that and organized them. So in the case of the Roman Empire, the classic theory is that the Goths and the Visigoths, after being somewhat subdued by the Roman Empire and the legions, were actually brought in, educated in it, and they were actually wanting an assignment from Rome about what to do. And when Rome couldn't organize it, they just took the thing over.
Got it. So it's a different
model. So I would argue. So I'm a Roman historian by background. I would argue that this is a good example of the mirror empire the other way, because this is late in the period. Rome expands in a very similar dynamic as Jim is sort of talking about. They get big and powerful and threatening to the tribes in, say, Germany, sort of the Rhine and Danube regions. So then those tribes get more organized. So it's the reverse mirroring.
Yeah, that's actually very good, Dan. That's
easy. And the Roman collapse is better explained by the internal, elite eating up, sort of an elite fraction of surplus dynamics that Jim talked about, rather than a threat from nomads. That's again one of the theories that sounds good but doesn't actually hold up as much as you say.
Interesting. Yeah, that's actually very helpful. Good. Thank you.
All right. And then the Goths, just because Rome ended up collapsing internally, there was all these goodies to take, and they were on the border. Off they came.
Right.
Okay, but back to this model, the way that I ran it here is that early on, I would populate that steppe region with about 50 randomly distributed nomadic tribes that maintained their structure throughout the whole thing. Again, they never annexed any state land and agrarian state land, and the states never annexed anything in the steppe nomads. So they stayed on either side of those borders. But nomadic tribes could end up confederating with one another to maintain their power against as the agrarian states grew and learned from in this case from the steppes, how to do more and more military, how to have more and more military power. But the confederations could only strike so far into the agrarian world. So this is this graphic on the right here shows that initially there, if you think of two agrarian states somewhat distant from the steppe, this is the steppe border here, this is the original a steppe tribe. It hasn't invented the technology at all, and these guys can grow as they wish. But at some point, I assert, some tribe invents the beginnings of this technology and begins to raid across the line according to some kind of strike zone, and so impacts this guy, but not this guy. This guy's too far away to be impacted by this, at least so far. But that causes this guy, this threat causes this guy to get bigger than the other one, because it's learning the technology slowly but surely. And eventually, this single tribe can't continue to dominate this agrarian tribe. But when the goodies here get to be about 6 million people, goodies are measured in people here, the states, the nomadic tribes that are out here decide to learn how to confederate with one another. That confederation of being able to coordinate many tribes to continue to attack in different kinds of really fantastic tactical ways, continue to put pressure on it, but they're also able to go deeper into the world, into the agrarian world, causing these guys now slowly to surely start growing as well. And that, depending on the geography, this guy could actually get bigger than this one. He's constrained between this hard border here and his neighbor. This one is not necessarily constrained. This grows bigger and is able to take over the state. So lots of interesting dynamics that can happen because of the layout of these strike zones. Now, confederations themselves collapse stochastically in this model. There's no internal war. I don't keep track of the warriors and their elite competition like I do for the agrarian states. Here it's a very simple kind of stochastic collapse that seems to be pretty good. You could probably do the other one, but I decided not to get too terribly complicated about the internals of the confederation. But just to show you what these strike regions look like, here is a map that shows you effectively where agrarian states can grow in different periods of time. The green lines and the blue, nothing can grow here. This is the Himalayan mountains. This is the steppe across which the nomads and the tribes can arrange, and these are the different strike zones. The red one, which you can just barely see here, is the shorter, not confederated version, where if you had a state here, then the nomads could pester it. And here is the black one, to allow big states big confederations to be able to attack inside. And what ends up happening is you assert, according to history, the invention of the bow and the horse cavalry happened in this region, the Pontic-Caspian region, in about 1000 BC. And it took about 500 years for it to go across the steppe. It took quite a long time for this technology to diffuse, probably largely because making the bows were actually quite hard to do. Steppe cavalry techniques about organizing, that probably actually moved quickly, but the actual weapon took quite a lot of time. But there is this substantial delay of 500 years, and that'll end up being important in matching the history. And then what happens over time is that agrarian states are able to open up more land, and as a consequence, new strike regions open up in different places. So you end up getting more and more mirror states that can be triggered out in this area as well. And then there is the learning between the threats, and this is a very simple thing. Each state looks around at its neighbors and looks to see S is a measure of its military efficiency, and if its own military efficiency is less than the maximum, then it learns somehow at some rate, and it modifies its technology over time. And I adapted a rate so that it apparently matches the rate at which this technology was adapted. And it took about 100 years to be able to get, or 130 years or so to get to be able to match the military technology. And of course, I went through a bunch of these different values during the simulations to see which one actually matched the history best. And that seems to be about it. And this was the learning rate both of the steppe nomads and the agrarian states. And what you end up having, this is the payoff, is you end up running simulations, and in bulk, you run, of course, many of them with various parameters. But what you end up getting is maps that look like this. So this is in history. The distribution of states for the first 1,000 years. You remember, we're starting the simulation in 1500 BC. This is the distribution of states historically, and this is what the model ends up as an aggregate gets. You can see that it's beginning to grow states here in China, and the distribution is more or less right. And you see a first fairly large steppe nomad empire historically, and we're getting them here as well. This is the next 1,000 years, and the next 1,000 years, and you can see now the expansion historically after the fall of Rome into Eastern Europe. And overall, this is the distribution. So this is the overall 3,000-year historical distribution, and this is the equivalent that you get out of the model. And you can see that we have populated this area with long-term, with the number of steppe nomads in a similar fashion, although we're a little high in many places still to get it. But we still get China being fairly concentrated in the Yellow River Valley, and eventually coming down into the southern part of China. And we get the spread into India and somewhat into Europe, more or less correct. And in terms of those other statistics, we get more or less the right spread. Some of this, of course, depends on the total amount of land that's available, since this is an area that's available for these nomadic states. But we also need to get the numbers. I mean, they could have been collapsing, in which case you can see them collapsing here. We're more or less constant throughout this period, but there's quite a lot of variation. You can see the standard deviation here of the area. So we're getting that more or less correct. We get the population more or less correct. This is because of the growth in agricultural technology in the medieval. And if it were, I think, if we were able to actually model the famines and the plagues that happened in this period and in this period, we'd actually probably be pretty close on to the population. We pretty well get the budget of the states. The total number of states. This includes both the nomads and the agrarian states. And we are able to explain about 75% of the spatial variation between these two, which is pretty high. And the last thing, of course, is to look at the distribution of states and their sizes and times, and we get this kind of distribution generated. We don't quite get the right number of very large states. So there's probably some discrepancy in the military technology, but nevertheless, we do get this distribution that shows that getting large doesn't necessarily get you long. It is fairly consistent. Okay, now to switch gears, unless there's questions about that, I'll just switch gears to the next model very quickly.
Well, one question about that.
Yeah.
So how do you separate? There's a bunch of parameters you have to set, which are kind of arbitrary because they're not really measurable. So how can you separate the different outcomes from choosing different parameters versus the structural dynamics of your theory, and to what extent are the various parameterizations of one theoretical core overlapping with the parameterizations of a different theoretical core?
Well, unfortunately, there aren't very many theoretical cores to compare against. The whole point about writing this model was to actually put together the first one, to try to even get it to go, so that somebody else would come along and say, no, I've got a better idea, including those ideas that Dan showed going into the graveyard. You know, let's use a different kind of hypotheses that could drive this, that doesn't involve the military or agrarian aspects. And I'm looking forward to that model, whatever that would be.
Excellent.
And in terms of, but nevertheless, your question is good, because parameters, you know, had to be chosen. I tried to keep the total number small, and some of them you can estimate. So it's pretty clear that the overall birth rate of population, which clearly drives the total number of warriors that are available, and of course is dependent on the agrarian productivity, those can actually be measured from historical data. So I took numbers that were actually fairly close, and you can see in the record when these productivity jumps did happen, and they're well attested to in the record. You know, the invention of moving away from millet to increase Chinese growth into rice, and then different kinds of rice when they were effectively invented and separated in about 1,000. The development of a different kind of plow to allow people to move into the Eastern European frontier to be able to deal with the heavy clay soils. These are actually fairly well documented, and with the yields that come largely from ecclesiastical records of being able to keep track of how much yield they're getting from different land. So those parameters are pretty well understood. The logistic ones, that is all driven by actually some military adventures. So for example, the strike distances, those are actually pretty well attested to from raids that the nomads were able to accomplish off the steppe, and how far they were able to get. The most famous one was the incursion into Baghdad, which gives you a fair, but not much further. They were unable to get much further south. So that gives you a bound in the total number of the actual distance of how far they could strike at different periods. In terms of the logistic thing, that is a relative measure, the relative efficiency. So what I actually cared about was getting the relative measures correct there. And there you can actually do experiments and do a sweep to find out that roughly the military efficiency, because of the nomads, doubled. If you triple it, it's far too much. You get big states that take over all the land far, far too fast. And you get steppe nomads that are constantly available. And the standard deviation that I showed in that one graph really gets quite narrow. So in order to be able to really get most of the stats, you can sweep through and get those relative measures. Now, what would be great is for a military historian to come along and actually try to understand why that doubling could be justified from the actual detailed logistics and the like. So that gives you a sense that I tried to actually get as many parameters to be measurable from previous historical sources as possible, so that the behavior would come out. And the important thing is, like that that motion from the Pontic Caspian steppe across to China, that 500-year lag, that's well attested to in the literature, and it ends up being critical to being able to get the statistics right, because that delayed the rise of the Chinese mirror empires with the Shuangnu by that amount of time, and that really impacts the statistics that you get, the bulk statistics. If you get China starting any earlier than that, it ends up invading into India and all sorts of things if you don't get that. So getting those historical facts, those contingent facts correct with the parameters was critical to getting this model to actually account for history. So that's a great question.
Yeah, and actually the fact that only a certain range of parameters agrees with the big trends is a insightful, is valuable.
Right. I mean, You have to remember, this is like 3,000 years of history over, I can't remember how many cells. I mean, it's really trying to account for a tremendous number of data points.
Yeah.
With a fairly simplistic model, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we doing on time? Shall I continue?
I think we can go late. I mean, I'd love to see the next section.
Okay, because I don't want to overrun the time here and make sure that Dan gets to his points. Well, just to switch gears, I wanted to talk very briefly about a different model that we've been working on, which is again, another agent-based model that tries to understand something about the population dynamics of the Neolithic, actually, in Europe, the mid-Holocene. What you see here is a map, a drawn map that shows what archaeologists think is the path out of Anatolia down here in about 9,000 BC, how farmers spread into Europe, and they went basically two paths. First, they went into the Aegean and then split, and there was one group that went along the Mediterranean coast and up this way, and the other group went through the Balkans, through Central Europe, and then moved in here. And these two groups actually met up in the Paris Basin in about 5,000 BC. There was a long pause, and then finally they all jumped across to the northern climes. They were able to adapt their lifestyle and their agrarian style to be able to live on these islands. And what's interesting is that you can see various kinds of pulses that happen. They hang around here for quite a while, then they pulse into the Aegean, and then they pulse out this way, and then there's another pulse. So that's an interesting distributional fact that we know about the population. And of course, there was another group that went out in this direction and out here, and we actually think that this group left the agrarian world and went into the steppe, and this is what ended up populating the steppe nomads that later came back to bite everybody as the steppe nomads confederated and learned cavalry. But that's of course the later story. What's interesting about the data that we have is that if you look at the radiocarbon dating from samples in these different regions, what you see is the radiocarbon data shows that first the world is invaded at some point and then the population grows, and then there are these drops that happen, these population declines. You can see them here. So it wasn't just a complete growth up to saturation. They actually grew and then collapsed for a while and then grew again. And this happened time and time again during these invasions and stable points. And the question is, what could we do to try to explain this pattern? And this is just the radiocarbon data, and I'll just focus on this slide. You can see this boom and bust period. And if you ask for what is the frequency at which this happened, you see that there is this peak of boom and bust that happens around 400, 500 years. That tends to go in, last for a while, and then decline. This is the first minimum location. And there's some larger patterns, but it's this pattern that dominates over all these records. It's all staggered, of course, because they're moving into this world at different times. But once they move into this world, there seems to be a decline that happens several hundred years later, and then a growth pattern again.
This is the upper right figure, right?
Right, that's right.
Year zero is when they move in, and then the centuries afterwards.
Correct. That's correct. So yeah, that's this lag time here. And you can see that it's this dip here when it's all synchronized that we're trying to explain. And you can see these outer lags here with some later things. These, of course, these pieces of data can only be gotten over several thousand years because they're happening back here. 3,000 years on, people are all the way out here. So a lot of these cyclings, these long-term cyclings, are happening at these earlier spots. Okay, so the question is, could we put together a fairly simple, now again, agent-based model of these villages that are spreading across, and could we get it to be explained? Well, there were two drivers that have been mentioned in the literature. One is that climate could have driven these kinds of rises and falls, and the other one that we posit was instead some kind of conflict that happened between the villages as they spread. And the short summary is, if you look at the climate world, you can get the climate records, and in spite of actually some fairly significant drops in 5200 BC and 4800 BC, most of the time the climate cycle, even though it's fairly high frequency because of temperature shifts, probably driven in this period by the beginning of the El Nino cycles. And what you see is, as population gets into these different regions, they grow up to the logistical limit, but they don't collapse back down. There is some variation because climate will drive you at the limit, but nothing that would explain the long-term decline. And in fact, what you see here, this is the gray is the previous data that we wanted to explain. We're getting frequencies which are fairly high frequency, much higher frequency than what we expected. So this does not seem to, long-term climate shifts do not seem to really explain these collapses. But if we posit that what ends up happening between villages is as they're migrating, they're able to migrate for a while out to a certain distance, but the people that are left behind, they find that as they try to migrate again, there's no place for them to really go. And again, like the previous model, they turn to battling, to taking over the goodies of the established tribes that are just within their reach. And they turn into aggressors and take that stuff and become and take other villages' goodies, and they stay that way, basically slowly but surely denuding the world of the previous villages that they helped, that their ancestors helped populate, until there's nothing left, in which case they go back to now farming in the now empty regions that they've helped to depopulate. So that it's a flip, a long-term flip between migrating, becoming farmers, growing things just fine, and then flipping into this mode of several of these villages turning into aggressors, denuding people. And if you look, this is what ends up happening. You see that just without even climate available, you see that it grows, then they turn into aggressors, and then there's a decline. It ends up, you can just barely see this one, it ends up now growing back again because it now is empty, and then back up again. And if you do the parameters, you can see that we actually are able to explain pretty well the variance that and the behavior. So this is an example of a model that we're putting forth as a way of explaining this data, which has not been able to be explained by previous things. So hopefully the additional models will show up to try to give equivalent explanations, and we can battle it out in the scientific literature. But what we were able to do was to show that this is one consistent way of explaining the radiocarbon data that archaeologists have been able to put together. And now I'll turn it back over to Dan. Yeah, by stopping sharing. Here we go.
I was muted. Okay. This is, as Jim said, taking this framework. We're doing a lot of things. We have a lot of projects trying to expand and, question by question, project by project, using this kind of approach and framework. Oh, we find a map about the spread of farmers in late Neolithic Europe. Okay, how can we explain that? Or we're looking at, the rise and fall of megastates in Eurasia. Okay, how do we explain that? And so this is sort of our approach and how we go. And, these questions are never fully settled. There's always, as you say, a potential other model can come along and try to explain the results better. But putting it in this kind of scientific structured way of, okay, well, let's actually pit, let's formalize it, let's be clear, let's pit these ideas against each other. We think, start to actually make some progress in understanding what's driving these patterns that, we've seen and known about, historians have known about for centuries, but now we're kind of getting into the causal mechanisms here. So we have a lot of things that were under our belts and on the go. One of the things I just want to talk about really quickly, because it relates to where we're headed now, is a focus of Jim and I and some other colleagues on what we're calling the dynamics of crisis. We're putting together this crisis database, which again is the same Seshat standard approach, but specifically focusing on periods of crisis, of social strain, of social stress. Essentially, if you think of Jim's model, those periods when, elite opportunity starts to decline, your per capita resources among sort of wealth holders and power holders starts to shrink, tensions start to rise, immiseration starts to hold in, like that period of kind of stagnation. That's what we're focusing on now. Okay, what actually happens? What are the different drivers? What are the different stresses? What are the different outcomes that can occur because of these periods? And again, really, this is trying to put the past and the present together. In Jim's framework, it's a very simplified model, but the theory that's driving that is about, the opportunity, the material, the social, the prestige, the political resources, how they're distributed, the kind of anger and frustration that can arise when conditions are poor, when well-being starts to decline. And again, these are happening today, right? These aren't just patterns from the past. These are things we're experiencing today as well. And so there's a lot of relevancy, there's a lot of linkages there. And so we're trying to determine what exactly is going on. So in this kind of framework, this project is trying to explain, okay, well, we think we have a handle on some of these key social pressures that can lead to crisis, that can create these, what we would call a revolutionary situation, high, tense, pressure-filled moments. But what we also see, and we've have some papers on the go about this right now, the actual specific outcomes from these periods of crisis are fairly variable, right? Often it's terrible, it's bad things, it's civil war, it's major disruptions, it's the complete collapse of these societies. Sometimes it's a little middling, there's some disruption, there's fighting, there's violence, but the society continues. Sometimes there's actually driven, these crises drive reforms and actually improve the well-being, improve the longevity, improve the resilience of the societies moving forward. Really what we're trying to unpack is, okay, well, what are the factors that actually determine this? And, once you enter into a crisis period, or at least a potential crisis period, what causes you to go down these different paths? Can we then use some of those insights to help us navigate these same kind of pressures that we're feeling today? And this is essentially the goal. I'm going to skip this, sort of covered that kind of ground. So again, we have a lot of, we're building the empirical record about these crisis periods, about the dynamics of how crises unfold. Now the goal is we're trying to put together, again, the same kind of modeling framework to explain that empirical record, to explain how and why these crises go the way that they do. We call it sort of, amongst ourselves, we say, well, basically we're trying to write a history of the near future. So if we are experiencing these pressures today, let's say, what's going to happen 10 years from now, looking back on the past 10 years, what will that history look like? Can we get a sense of what we can expect given our understanding, given these sort of causal models? We're putting this into a framework, what we're calling the multi-path forecasting model, very similar to the modeling framework that Jim was explaining, but again, specifically focused on these kinds of pressures and how they interact with other forces, maybe economic forces, environmental forces, how they lead to this kind of disruption. So this graph is taken from, again, our colleague Peter Turchin in 2010, using these theories, using a very simple version of this model, put together a prediction saying, okay, well, I'm looking at a number of global north countries, the US, the UK, others, tracking instability, using this idea, this model of social pressure, you say, well, yeah, in 2010, instability is kind of low. The social pressures aren't quite at the critical mass yet, but they're growing. And in 2010, he then predicted, within 10 years, by about 2020, we are going to see a lot of unrest and violence and instability in these countries based on his model of the social pressures. And unfortunately, he was absolutely right. These predictions, these forecasts were accurate. And so this sort of gave some legitimacy and boost to our work in these modeling efforts. So this is part of what we are doing. Jim, myself, Peter, others are trying to refine and really formalize this model, this multi-path forecasting framework trying to put together these insights and compare it to the growing empirical record that we're doing. This is a little hard to see, it's kind of messy, but this is essentially the model that Peter used to make that 2010 prediction. This is then sort of updated in 2020. The key line here is this red line. This is essentially the violence, the instability, the unrest being modeled here based on these other factors that drive social pressures. This is the status quo. This is, again, seeing the sort of moment. This is for the US, I should say. The moment in the sort of early 60s, 1970s into the early 1980s, this period of kind of social tension that played itself out. Then there was this prediction in 2010 here. You can see the model predicts that instability, that these pressures are going to rise, peak around now, 2020, mid-2020s, burn themselves out. But if you don't do anything, then these pressures, the structural pressures are still there. The inequality is going to build back up. The resource depletion is going to build back up. The frustration and the anger is going to build back up. So you would expect in, another couple of generations, there's going to be another equally large spike in violence. We call this the cycles of discord, right? If you don't do anything, the tension can burn itself out. The conditions can change a little bit, but if the structure remains the same, you're just going to get that peak of instability, another cycle again. So what we're trying to do again is refine this kind of model and understand what is driving these periods of instability, and then start looking at, okay, well, what can we actually do? What happens if, let's assume we have agency to change some of these parameters? We can have what we would call policy interventions. Let's play around. Let's simulate different scenarios based on different hypothetical interventions. What do we expect would actually make a difference? So let's say there's a sort of inequality reduction intervention. Again, bypassing the actual political sort of logistics of how to actually put these into place. But let's assume we can do things like improve the real wages of workers, right? So take out some of that sting of immiseration of the population. Let's assume we can do things that can reduce elite competition. And again, take some of that sting of the elite competition that drives civil unrest, that's even driving Jim's model. So if we assume that we can keep those lower, the model then predicts that you will have a longer, lower period of instability, right? It'll remain suppressed for a longer period. This is a sort of conflict reduction idea. If we can explore different scenarios like this, using this modeling framework, comparing it to the historical empirical record, the idea is then to take these ideas, start to talk to policymakers, start to talk to stakeholders and say, okay, well, our model suggests that, improving real wages amongst a sort of population facing the stress will be a key, could be a key lever to pull. Let's talk about how to actually do that in your district, right? So let's start having these conversations. This is what SODI is really for, is to just provide that platform to do this, to take our modeling work, to take our historical work and develop these kind of insights. So really, this is something that Jim and I are very engaged in right now, is trying to develop this modeling framework about crises, about social pressures, and really build these kind of scenario exploration tools and start to unpack and learn some of these lessons and shop them around. Again, we're taking different approaches. There's still work in progress. Would love to hear people's insights about different modeling approaches that we can do, different factors to take into account. But this is really at the center of what we're focused on for at least the next few years as we go. And that's really all we wanted to say. Thank you very much for your time. Wanted to shout out to all the funders and sponsors and supporters that we've had, again, over about a decade of work trying to build up this data and these modeling approaches. Thank you so much for your attention. I don't know, Greg, are there other questions, other things you want to discuss?
Fantastic. Thank you. I do have one question actually from the last section. A lot of this stuff sounds a lot like the four-turning model that the Neil House. And I guess, but my question would be how you start incorporating or not those insights, because like according to him, every other one of these cycles is going to be like the 60s one. They're just too disorganized to listen, whereas now they're going to have a huge crisis. Now's the time to panic, and this is the generation that will respond constructively. And you would recommend very differently, according to that theory, in the two subcycles.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. I would say the major difference between sort of this modeling framework and the Neil and Howe model is they are very descriptive, whereas we are a little more not quite prescriptive. We're a little more sort of causally driven, is that we are trying to not only explain and characterize these cycles and then offer a sort of descriptive explanation of what might be going on, but to have a really sort of formal causal model about what actually drives these cycles. And that's what these other lines are. These are the social pressures that, again, theoretically motivated lead to this unrest. And so what that then suggests, and you're absolutely right, that the specific recommendations will depend on kind of, not just where you are in the cycle, but what are the specific mixture of pressures that you are experiencing that might be rising this. And this is why formalizing these different pressures in this way is super important, because it's not just, the overall level of tension. You want to know what are the different factors that are going into it. So in other words, it may be immiseration of the general populace that is driving tension in one situation that would suggest certain interventions. It may be that there's a specific type of elite tension around, prestigious political positions or around other factors that's driving it that recommends different interventions. It may be that the state itself, the institutions, are becoming fragile, that they are declining, that sort of state capacity is declining. That would recommend other interventions. The instability will look the same in any of those cases, but the particulars of what's driving it will matter. So you really want to be able to unpack those, and that's what this sort of modeling framework is about. The generational cycle, I mean, that social issue can feed into part of why and how the instability burns itself out. But again, you really want to be able to tease apart the specific mechanisms that's leading to that. Sorry, Jen.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that. I mean, if you read the Neil, the Howe material, they're basically an intergenerational cycling model where one generation impacts the next, depending on what sort of, starting with an initial major stressor that imprints one generation, and then another one grows up without that. What's really interesting about those kind of cycles is it's somewhat addressed in this model with the ability to radicalize more and more people. But what's really interesting is that it's really unclear in the Howe model. They require this sort of external threat to sort of start the fourth turning model going. And they're expecting that somehow another shock would happen. I mean, if the original thing was World War II happens, and that starts an entire world of the greatest generation, and then the Eisenhower generation, and then finally a 1960s generation, and then finally a generation that tries the whole thing over, but they now need something else to sort of get them to come back together again and become another great generation. And the fourth turning is supposed to be this great collapse sort of idea, allowing you to turn into the next thing. Well, what's really interesting, if you look at all of their data and other people, you can see that kind of pattern that happens, but where the actual drivers for those major cataclysms come from is not really dealt with in the model. Sometimes they're external, sometimes they're internal, and that's the point of this work, is to try to understand the sources of those things and what would amplify effectively the Neil and Howe model. So for example, the 60s, the causal model that we have says not only are you're moving along and the population is increasing, but because of the war, there was a youth bulge of many, many more kids in the 60s, and with less and less opportunity. So they're really going to get really upset quite a bit more, so that we actually have an almost economic driver in addition to the ideological one. These kinds of factors is what you need to tease apart in order to be able to give predictive value to when and what the consequences of a Howe kind of model is going to be. And of course, it also is really interesting that, for example, Steve Bannon, who's one of the the guys who really got into this model, he went into the orbit of President Trump to be able to actually accelerate the fourth turning, taking this and really trying to really make sure that it happened as quickly as possible, really believing this. And of course, he really didn't have to work very hard because the elites were already going at it. I mean, this is the whole point of our model that Dan showed, is that we already expected this kind of inter-elite competition. So there is some overlap, but again, without really knowing these fundamental drivers to understand the timing and the magnitude and which policy interventions are actually going to work, including which policy interventions, if you wanted to burn it down faster, you really need the models that we're trying to build, much more quantitative. So
it seems like they're actually complementary. The way I've read that book, it seems like in the fourth turning, people are just looking for a fight. Whatever is going to come up, they'll make a fight out of it, right? So it doesn't seem like it doesn't matter what the driver is. Whereas, I mean, they're complementary. Like for you, it's good to have that description. And one thing that seems like he has, as a verbal attempt at capturing the mood, these are the kind of people that would have high consumer confidence, low consumer confidence, social bonds. Do they feel them? Do they not feel them? But these are measurable, and they can be their evolution can be tracked over time, like number of political or not apolitical clubs that people belong to over the decades. And they seem to be complementary to the more economic or military kind of drivers that you're accounting for.
Well, I mean, as Jim says, we're trying to account for the social and ideological drivers as well. Here in this talk, we talked more about the sort of military and economic drivers, but let's say the non-material, the social, political, and economic and ideological surplus is also an important factor. So it's not just the material surplus and that kind of per capita let's say decline in the availability of surplus of material resources. It's also the surplus and the per capita availability of prestige positions.
Yeah.
Jim talks about like the youth bulge thing is a big part of the theory of some of the theories that we're looking at. The idea again is if you have this sort of large cohort of young people, and your economy is kind of growing, they have some wealth. Often you're investing in education, they're educated, they're going through the ranks, they're doing all this effort to get prestigious positions, whatever that happens to be. It changes society to society, but sometimes it's, the top post in government or administration, sometimes it's, the biggest, most valuable law firm or banks or, whatever is sought after. And if you're population and people who have sort of dedicated time and money into attaining these positions is growing faster than the availability of those positions, supply and demand, competition is going to increase. And that's a major part of our driver. And that's economic, but it's also the social, political, ideological that all gets hooked up into it. And again, as Jim says, I mean, the key thing there about, yes, the fourth turning can be very, have some intuitive appeal because it does seem to be describing the mood, as you say, of a lot of the anger and the frustration. But again, in order to do something about it, you would want to know not just the mood and not just be able to kind of characterize what's going on, but understand why. Because then that lets you go from just being kind of reactive to being a little more proactive and being able to say, okay, well, if these are the drivers of that kind of mood and we see those drivers existing in my society, we can expect then that this kind of anger and unrest is going to unfold, and therefore let's do something about it now. Which is, as Jim said, I mean, because if it's a sort of reactive thing, it's, well, there's nothing you can do about it. So let's just try to make it burn itself out as quickly as possible, right? If the underlying drivers aren't exposed, that's when you get into the mindset of, okay, well, this is just a thing that's happening. Let's just get through it. We're trying to put that on its head a little bit and expose what are the drivers of this mood and this unrest. The other thing that I will say about that work is, again, as Jim said, your initialization makes a huge difference in sort of how their model plays out in that generational scheme. It has proven very fragile when you try to apply it to other moments, different places in time, different historical periods. Generations are different. The timing is a little bit different. Because there's not the drivers, it's really difficult to know if this applies anywhere else. Whereas we're looking for something that's a little more generalizable. That's another difference, if that makes
Still
sense.
in that one, how do you separate? I think people point to now is probably a time, maybe I'm just misinterpreting. Now is a time to give people candy, whereas in the 60s, it's time to liberalize society because the pressures are, I think it's a research competition now, whereas in the 60s would be to constrain a society that was built 20, 30 years earlier. Is that a fair, like this, the valves you want to open are different on the two cycles?
But I would argue not as much as that, but definitely, at least potentially, there's differences in the valves you would open. I think that, you know, in the 60s, we are seeing a lot of the, well, not all, yeah, some of, but not all of the kinds of social pressures we're seeing today. To me, one of the things that's most different that you're seeing, you know, in the US and the UK, even in Canada, where I'm based, today that's a little bit stronger of a pressure than you were seeing, at least in the 60s, is some of the like institutional and state capacity stuff. A lot of the inequality, the economic, the kind of social pressures are very similar. There seems to be, for various reasons, the state capacity has been declining to a more severe rate now. I would argue a lot of because of the reaction to the unrest of the 60s and 70s and then the 80s flip. We can get into that. But that's one of the reasons why, like, even in this model, and again, this is matched by the empirical data, the 60s and the 70s, the sort of the index of social stress and then the resultant inequality, it spiked, but it wasn't as huge of a spike as we saw, say, in 2020. And to me, that's one of the reasons it's that mix. So it had a lot of the pressures, not all the pressures. But I think that speaks to your point. You're exactly right. This is, again, why we need to know not just the overall, not just the general sort of dynamics of anger and unrest. We want to know the details of what's going on in different communities. That is the specific mixture of pressures. Because as you say, the specific valves that we then need to release to relieve those pressures will be different. And this is, again, why it's important to have this general model that we can go and apply and tune differently to different societies, which may have, you know, overall a similar structure and dynamic, but it's going to be different specific things that are, you know, maybe it's you know, the competition in the US is to get into the best, you know, Ivy League university to get into law school. In China, it's to get a good post in a good province in the administration. It's the same basic pressure, but the specifics are different, and therefore the specific interventions are going to be different. That's what we want to be able to have, is this framework that can be modulated in different ways for exactly those reasons that you mentioned.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you very much. It was fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Yeah, thank you too. Great to talk to you.
All right.
Wow.